How are you doing? Today I wanted to talk a little bit, as you know, we've gotten really into over half the material for the semester, and so we wanted to talk about another aspect that coaches are going to be involved with, or at least they're expected to be involved with. Social development. We've talked about this before. Sport is considered an extension of the classroom, and you learn values, and you learn how to be an integrated part of society, and all these different types of things. At least that's the utopian model that's been established here in the United States. And this also explains why sport, as compared to perhaps other places around the world, here in the United States, it's related to education. When we talk about student athletes, we talk about scholastic athletes, and the youth sport model is based upon this whole notion of a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, which is holistic development. And holistic development comes out of kind of the social psychology and educational research that was looking at social development. If you ever had to take a class, human development or human growth and development, things like that, it was a bit of physiology and psychology sort of mixed together. Well, when you start getting into especially junior high or middle school, scholastic sports, and then also this whole idea of intercollegiate athletics, holistic development takes on a slightly different connotation, because it's talking about helping the individual grow and evolve exogenous or away from, outside of whatever playing field or outside the sport. And so you're going to be talking about how those young men and young women are going to grow as people, talk about the skills that they can develop, how they can start to think about things in their life such as a career, but then also how to manage a lot of these emotions that tend to be highly volatile at this time in the social development of individuals. Not, forget the fact that a lot of these individuals are student athletes, and that's an extra layer of emotions that you have to deal with. When you start thinking about, okay, where does this information come from? And like I said before, it primarily comes out of the realm of social psychology and some educational research. And the idea is that whether it's a double standard or not, maybe a manager doesn't have to worry about the holistic development of their employees as much. The coach is akin to a teacher. Okay? Now, teachers teach in a classroom environment and have a curriculum that they disseminate to students. Okay, what's the curriculum of sport? You have the actual sport itself, but it's also how to interact with other people, and there's sort of a social fabric that is there. And so these coaches tend to be seen as kind of quasi-teachers that are teaching quote-unquote life lessons, and that is related to this whole notion, or the underlying foundation of holistic development. The individual in which we are embedded, that is going to influence our personal experiences. The coach helps to define the atmosphere, define the culture of that team, of that athletic department perhaps, if they're in said position. And as a result, if they're in an athletic department, you can also start to control or influence or impact the interactions that these student athletes have, not only with fellow student athletes and athletic administrators and personnel, but also in the university or the scholastic environment, also as well in the surrounding communities. And so holistic development is one of those things that it really starts to kind of get at this notion of who we are, what purpose does sport serve. Now, when you start looking at student athlete development, there's a lot of theories or paradigms that are out there. And I don't want to go too much into this stuff, but just it's important, again, like we've said all along, to have some sort of framework that we can draw from. And when you're talking about student development theory, which kind of comes out of educational research, especially focusing on college students, for example, it's called psychosocial theory. And what it does is it talks about the identity of who we are. Now remember, we talked about with symbolic interactions that the identity of who we are as an individual is associated with a lot of different roles that we play throughout the day. If you're a student athlete, if you're a sibling, if you're a son or a daughter, you're a student, you're a coworker, all these different roles influence us. All these roles have expectations as well. All right? And when you start thinking about especially student athletes at the college level, one of the things that we have to guard against is called role homogeneity. Homogeneity meaning basically the same, all right, or one. And the idea is that elite athletes, we know, have very high sport-specific self-confidence. That means that within the realm of their sport, practice and executing the tasks associated with that sport, they're extremely confident. Many of these individuals, elite athletes, however, especially at the college ranks, outside of the athletic arena or endeavor, have very low self-esteem, especially in those power and performance sports like football, basketball, etc. Those more revenue-generating sports where role homogeneity is much more crucial to the success of the individual. You have to invest so much in playing the game of basketball, for example, that it becomes a huge part of who you are. And as a result, these people tend to see themselves as one thing. And you're like, well, but I've known athletes and they were like pretty arrogant in classes and stuff like that. And why is that? Psychology would say, look, those are coping mechanisms. All right. I'm not here to look at the books or hit the books. I'm here to play ball. All right, and that's sort of being aloof. That aloofness is a coping mechanism. I don't care about school anyway. So if I do poorly, it doesn't really matter. All I have to do is stay eligible, and I'm good to go. And then eventually that coping mechanism turns into what we call hubris, which is pride-driven arrogance or self-confidence, where you feel like nothing really applies to you. And this is very, very endemic for those elite athletes, professional, collegiate, and even scholastic at times. And that's what we're starting to see as well with more media coverage at the scholastic level. You have these things, this arrogance that's starting to form and develop. Well, all right, who's going to be involved in that process? The coach is going to be very, very important in that process. Confidence of the individual is related to the motivation within sport. That comes directly out of sports psychology. Confidence is also associated with the power and authority figures that are associated with a particular sport, meaning that the coach has control over dynamics to increase or decrease confidence, not just confidence related to a sport, but confidence related to those exogenous things outside of sport, school, personal relationships, etc. So what we know is the coach is a very, very impactful figure, especially for collegiate student athletes. Taking psychosocial theory one step further, Chickering and Reeser, they came up with, it gets very complicated if you want, but kind of boiling it down, it's talking about psychosocial theory is looking at how confidence is developed, how you manage those emotions that are going to be ever present, and how the individual develops independence, which means you go from being reliant on the rules and structure to developing autonomy, which gives you independence as an individual. All right, generally what you see is that, for example, within the world of sports, freshmen come in, and if they're going to play and be eligible right away, then oftentimes the coach has to take a little bit more time, provide more structure. As they become sophomores, juniors, and then perhaps seniors if they stay around for that, then what you see is that they've learned things, they've grown as an individual, and they usually take control over something like an off-season program, working on their skills both in and outside the classroom. Also, psychosocial theory is really looking at how relationships develop and the purpose of these relationships. You have utilitarian relationships, you have much more personal, intimate relationships, and then finally this whole notion of developing integrity. And it's kind of an understanding of integrity is one of those things that's difficult to define because it kind of comes out of ethics and understanding morality, but basically doing the right thing, being a stand-up person. And then what they really, really talk about with psychosocial theory is that this does not happen at one time. These student athletes are going to progress through a series of stages. Who is going to be there to serve as an integrator from stage to stage to stage? That's what the coach is. And so if you have a coach that says, hey, you need to focus on everything in the classroom and it's all about, or excuse me, everything on the court and it's all about winning, then maybe some of those other things like classroom performance are going to falter. Also, you hear a lot of coaches say, hey, look, you need to take care of your business in the classroom. You need to stay eligible. Well, the focus then isn't about learning and developing a career. It's a means to an end. You need to remain eligible. Therefore, you need to X, Y, and Z. And what we do know is when you look at cheating scandals involving collegiate athletes, it's usually this need, this desperate need to pass, to remain eligible, because there's an incongruity in terms of how people see the college classroom. And this is not only with student athletes, okay? It's kind of the whole idea of survive and advance. A lot of people say, look, my undergraduate degree was 120 some odd plus hours, and I'm not going to remember everything. Truth be told, I took ecology as a junior in college. I don't remember a lot about ecology. I'm not an ecological scientist or anything like that. I mean, pond eutrophication was one of the things I remembered, how that green scum forms in a pond or in a static body of water. That's pretty much it. Right? There's this disconnect between why are we in the classroom? We're supposed to be learning. Well, because it's become so complicated and modern life is so complicated and we have all these different things, oftentimes what's focused on is the grade, not necessarily learning material. So when you're talking about this whole idea of development, holistic development, if you will, how can coaches impact student athletes? How can they help them develop? And then where is this quote-unquote line regarding how involved a coach should or should not be in the lives of student athletes? I had a friend, he's still a friend. I have a friend who used to be a women's basketball coach and at the Division II level in the NCAA. And he was assistant coach for a long time and recently became a head coach. And he had to deal with 3 very unique issues within the first probably 18 months that he was on a job as a head coach. He had 2 of his players that came to him and were worried about they were pregnant and they didn't know what to do and they didn't know how this was going to impact their life. And they came to their head coach for advice. And then a third person, a third woman that was associated with the basketball team, said that she believed she was sexually assaulted and what to do. She was scared to report it to authorities because she was afraid there wasn't enough evidence and that people were just going to see her in an unseemly light and that kind of thing. That is a lot to lay at the foot of a coach. You know, we talk about coaches aren't trained necessarily for things like this, but we expect coaches to impact the lives of the student athletes that they're involved with. So I'm not saying what a coach should or should not do, but each coach's philosophy with regard to understanding development and how they should quote unquote be there for their athletes or their kids, that's up to each individual coach. If you're a head football coach at the NCAA level, Division I, so you've got roughly anywhere between 80, if you're FCS and FBS level, you've got 85 scholarships or you've got 65 scholarships roughly. That's a lot of people that are associated with your program. The head coach probably isn't going to know every single person. Right? And so this whole understanding of development, it's really up to the individual. And what we'd like to do is when we're talking about this is just give some ideas for what it is that people can do. There's been a large body of research recently, kind of starting since the late 1980s, which sounds a long time ago for some of you, but for me, as old as I am, the late 80s, early 90s, it was just, oh man, that was just recent, okay? So don't judge. Anyway, so this line of scholarship is called College Choice Factors, and it originally started to look at how and why potential students choose the college or university that they want to attend. Well then, in the late 80s, early 90s, people started applying that model and those ideas to student athletes. What is it that brings a student athlete to a particular university, college, or community college? And some of the research has shown, or almost all the research has shown, that there's one overwhelming factor: the head coach. Regardless of facilities, winning percentage of the team, tradition, social atmosphere of the team, whatever, almost, and I will speak personally, remember I was telling you, it's the 3rd time I've referenced it, which is rather embarrassing, I apologize, but remember we've talked about a couple times that grant where I worked on looking at community college softball here in the state of Kansas. Alright, in that particular, the outcome of that research, well over 90% of the individuals that were playing softball came to those particular community colleges because of the relationship with the head coach that they developed. So what does this say? Well, what this says is that the head coach is more important than anything. In that relationship with the head coach, there's a lot invested by those athletes. And so the assumption is, from society, from parents, from educators, is that coaches now are taking that, and they're not just there to develop skills, but they're also there to help hone or develop other aspects of the student athlete. Personal growth, social growth, emotional growth, career development, things like that. trying to increase the opportunities for interaction that these individuals have. Another thing that coaches can do, and this is called a behavioral intervention plan. And this kind of I was exposed to these when I was working with juvenile offenders in the criminal justice system. Okay, but behavioral intervention plans are actually used by many coaches and sports psychologists as well. And the process is universal. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about you have a baseball player who's dropping their shoulder, and so when the ball's coming, they drop their away shoulder, and that causes them the trajectory of the bat to swing up a little bit, and you get your little can of corn where you pop up the ball in the infield. Okay? Yo, hold on a second. Alright, sorry about that. Someone was calling in the office. These crazy students with their crazy questions, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, we're talking about behavioral intervention plans. And these are used by coaches that want to work on one specific aspect of a player's performance. And I think the example I was giving was dropping his shoulder while you're swinging the baseball bat, and that causes you to swing the bat inefficiently. And so what you do is, if you want to change that, first of all, you identify that behavior. You figure out some way to address that, and figure out some way that you can have a new behavior. You provide a plan of how to reach that. You show them how to do it, and then throughout the season you evaluate it, etc., etc. Okay. Well, the same thing is if you're talking about working with student athletes. The student or athletic student services. Or student athlete services. It goes by a variety of different names depending on what school you're involved with. At the college level, basically these are individuals that are trained in educational research, trained to work with student athletes in kind of social psychology, and some social aspects, and they try to help these individuals develop career plans and become successful in everything that they do. And they're primarily focused on time management and things away from the sport. It's how to, balance everything. Well, oftentimes at the Division I level, the vast majority of the academic non-qualifiers is every university, depending on what level, they get different non-qualifiers. People that could not get into that college or university, that are allowed to get into that college or university to participate in extracurricular activities. Okay, well, the vast majority of these individuals at the Division I level are for football and men's and women's basketball. Okay, so you have a lot of these at-risk or high-risk students coming in. So if you want this person to be successful, you can tell them, hey, you need to stay eligible, let them go on their merry way, and then usually, and I would sort of guesstimate, and this is sort of a anecdotal percentage, but roughly 50 to 60% of these individuals would probably not be successful. So you need to have a plan in place. If you're going to bring a non-qualifier academically to your school, then you want to put him or her in the best possible position to be successful. Okay? That's what a behavioral intervention plan does. And the idea is that once you identify what the behavior is, hey, you need to increase your performance in the classroom, for example. Well, how do you go about doing that? One of the things is that we know that almost 70% of learning disabilities are not diagnosed until these individuals are into their adulthood. Alright, that means you have a lot of individuals that perhaps they have learning disabilities. Not everyone does, okay? Just because you had bad grades in high school doesn't mean you had a learning disability. Alright? But you're going to meet with each individual student, and what we know is that if the student athlete meets with just the student athlete services personnel, they're probably not going to be as successful. If you have the coach that's involved, then what you see, and if you're at smaller schools or community colleges, the coaches tend to be much more involved in the day-to-day interactions of their students. Okay, this is just kind of a recipe for how to begin putting together a BIP. Now, how you go about doing this is, really it's completely up to you all. But, like I said before, the most important thing for us is just realizing that the coach can be involved. One of the things that we talked about doing and working with Cali College, especially the basketball team, was doing a three-pronged BIP or player development plan that focused on these three different aspects: personal development, community relationships, and technological responsibility. I'll start with the last one first. Technological responsibility. I'm not a social media guy. I'm not really even a cell phone guy. I'm not a technology kind of guy, right? But what I do realize is that technology and social media in particular are changing so rapidly that what you need to do is educate student athletes about the responsibility and the weight that is associated with things like Facebook, Twitter. I know that I don't have a Twitter account, but I know that I can go onto Google and I can find Twitter posts for 6 or 7 months for any athlete that I want to look up or any person that I want to look up. You don't even necessarily have to be a follower of that person. So, you lose a big game, you lash out at the referees or the community or something like that. It's out there, man. And it's floating. It's this big meatball that's just floating there in cyberspace, and it's bad for you as an individual, it's bad for the team, and it's bad for the athletic department and that particular college and or university. And I'm not even going to pretend like I know all the different social media websites, not even websites anymore, they're just sites. Look, I don't even know the language to use when talking about it. So obviously, when it comes to implementing these behavioral intervention plans, I don't do the technology part. Okay, that's someone else who does that. Now, community relationships is realizing that there's a collective identity. And what a lot of people don't realize is, let's say you're talking about a community college athletes down at Cali. 7- and 8-year-old kids do not realize that these student athletes are not professional athletes. They don't see them differently. They see them as role models, regardless of whether these 18, 19, 20-year-olds want to be seen as role models. They are. All right? And there is an impact, an association. Sport is involved in a relationship with the community, because sport and higher education in general could not exist without the support of some sort of community. Okay? And so a little bit of PR and understanding how to develop an identity that's bigger than just yourself. Egocentrism means you focus just on yourself. And it's not bad all the time. It just means you're very, very self-aware, and your ability to interact with other people and step outside of you and emote to other people or communities has been retarded somewhat. Okay? The personal development plan, and that's what I try to, a little bit more information right here. Some of the things that I try to hit on: time management skills, impression management as well, study habits. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, I know, no. And we go through and I provide statistics and I try to dispel the myths and the fact that you can take notes on your smartphone or your tablet all you want. But we also know that there is such a great ability, or what's what I'm looking for. There's temptation to be involved in other things, looking at apps, looking at different websites, checking this and that. All right? So most of the time, those people that focus just on going to school with one device generally don't do as well as those that realize that learning is a multifaceted process. Some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, some people are a combination of both, some are tactile. They need more kind of hands-on activities and where they need to learn things that way. Alright, so there's a lot of different things, and this whole idea of reading your notes once right before the exam doesn't work. I know a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm the king or queen of, cramming at the last minute, or those people that say that, oh, I can BS with the best of them on a paper. Look, I've been doing this for 13 years, and I will tell you, you can tell the person that tried to write, even if they're a gifted writer, they tried to write their paper the night before. It just doesn't have the depth to it. Also, what's really interesting, and I saw this first when I went to community college as well, and the first time I ever saw this whole idea of in-class relationships was that the basketball coach made his basketball players sit on the front row of every classroom. And he would try to go, he or an assistant coach or a team manager or something would go to every student's class and make sure they were sitting on the front row. It was impression management. The idea is it's kind of hard to fall asleep if you're in the first row. If nothing else, there's a teacher that is literally 2 feet away from you, spitting and talking, and the volume is much louder than if you're sitting in the back. Also, it's a little bit less comfortable in the front There's no back, like if you sit in the last chair that maybe leans up to a wall or a blackboard or something like that, you can kind of rest your head. You can check Facebook, and then you can start to doze off, and it's a little harder to do on the front row. Okay. Also, trying to promote student athletes to go out and interact with other students, not just athletes. What we do know is that student athletes tend to socialize only with student athletes, especially women. Now, males that tend to have, how do I say it, romantic relationships, these tend to be with non-student athletes. All right, so there is some interaction outside of the athletic world, but what we're trying to do is make sure that in class there are relationships that transcend the athletic department. How do all these things work? It's kind of give and take. There's not necessarily a formula, but what we do hope is that at some point coaches realize that as student athletes develop, that they should be a part of this process. Now, the extent to which they want to be a part of the process is up to each organization, each team, each athletic department, and ultimately each coach.